we're joined by Alelia Bundles, author, journalist, and award-winning news producer. And as a brief background for those who don't know who Madam C.J. Walker is, she's your great-great-grandmother, and she is not and has nothing to do with hair care straightening products. So could you give us a brief bio of who she actually is?
Certainly. So I'm really glad to be here with you and to be able to talk about Madam Walker and my work as a journalist. But Madam C.J. Walker was my great great grandmother. The brief story of her is that she was born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on the same plantation in Delta, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River, where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. She was orphaned at 7, married at 14, a widow at 20 with a 2-year-old daughter, a washerwoman until she was 38. But by the time she died in 1919 at 51 years old, she was a millionaire who had created a company, the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, that made hair care products, employed thousands of women, and used her money and her influence as a philanthropist, as a political activist, and as a patron of the arts.
Now, as you state in your book, working for the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company runs as part of the legacy of the Walker women in your family, and your mother became the fourth generation executive of the company, but she didn't require that of you. So why is that?
Well, I think my mother wanted me to be able to do what was in my heart and what my passion was. And she had felt that she needed to do that. She went to Howard and majored in business and chemistry, preparing herself to work for the Walker Company. But she really wanted me and my brothers to follow our own dreams. And my real passion was writing. I thought I was a writer starting at 8 years old when I had a story published in a children's magazine. I had a 30-year career in network television news as a producer and an executive, but the seed had been planted for me to tell this story about Madam Walker when I was a student at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. So I was developing this career, developing my own identity, my own professional chops, but this story was so great that it kept drawing me back in.
Yeah, just to go back quickly, you studied journalism at Columbia. What drew you to journalism specifically?
Well, as I said, when I was 8 years old, I wrote this short story. One of my mother's friends, who was a school teacher, thought it was a good story, sent it to a children's magazine. So I, in my own mind, was a writer. I couldn't carry a tune, so I clearly was not going to be the lead person in the school choir. But I started working for the school newspaper in junior high school, and I'm really lucky that it was a junior high school newspaper with a great newspaper advisor who entered us into national contests and had really high standards. So at 12 years old, 13 years old, I knew how to write a news story. And I carried that through high school and then into college when instead of working for the school newspaper, because that was more like hard work, I became a DJ for the jazz department. And then that led to a television internship. And then that led me to going to Columbia and then working at NBC News and ABC News.
And just because Newhouse is a school of journalism, we have a BJ major, do you remember the process of what it was like writing your first journalism story?
Well, the very first one was in 7th grade. And so we learned the, who, what, when, where, why. So that I knew. And by the time I got to Columbia, I already knew how to write a news story. I had worked at Newsweek and I had worked in my high school newspaper. And so I understood the basic inverted pyramid of writing a news story. But when I graduated from Columbia, I mean, we had assignments as you do, real assignments as you do in journalism school. But when I got to NBC News, I was learning the mechanics and all of the tools of using video along with the written word. So obviously it's very different, to marry the pictures and the words. And I had been initially, because they don't give you a lot of responsibility when you first get to a network, I was doing stories that it really wouldn't have mattered whether anybody watched them. But I got my first real taste of what it was like to be in the thick of things when I moved from New York to Houston. And it was NBC's bureau in Houston. It was a small bureau with one correspondent, one other producer, a camera crew in Dallas, a camera crew in Houston. And I was the other producer. So when something would happen and the other producer was somewhere else, I was the only one they could send. And that meant that I was thrown into the thick of things. So I remember being the producer on a grain elevator explosion in New Orleans. A lot of death and a long time waiting. It just, a lot of tragedy. So that, I think, when I think about when I really began to get a real taste of what it meant to be a reporter and to be a producer, that was the story.
And you spent quite some time telling people's stories across the country, right? When did you decide that you wanted to focus on your own family's narrative instead?
So this story with Madam Walker was something that I began to get an inkling of even before I could read. In my grandfather's apartment, in what had been my grandmother's dresser, as a little girl at 3 years old, when my mother and my grandfather would sit in the living room, I would play in that room, and I opened the drawers, and inside were things like ostrich feather fans and miniature mummy charms and mother of pearl opera glasses that had belonged to Madam Walker and her daughter, Alelia Walker, my namesake, who was very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance. So I knew something about them. My mother worked at the Madam Walker Company. So that story was there, but I was off trying to do my own thing. When I got to Columbia, Phyllis Garland, who was the only Black woman on the faculty, recognized my name, Alelia, and put two and two together and realized that I had a connection to the Walker women, though I was not talking about that. And she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker?" And I said, "Yes, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." So I wrote that paper in the fall of 1975 into the spring of 1976. But then I went to work. I needed to go to work, and I worked at NBC. But on holidays and weekends, I would do research and I would go to conferences. So I was on the side telling that story. But ultimately, I wrote a young adult biography. Alex Haley had interest in the story. I was doing research for him. He died without having written a book. And so that was when I really was going full steam ahead and trying to write the story. I knew it was an important story that needed to be told. And I thought Alex was just kind of the runway that had gotten me to the point where I could take off and fly.
Now, Alex Haley, if I'm correct, he's the writer of the autobiography of Malcolm X, who transcribed it. So when did that first come about? When did you first learn about Alex Haley taking interest in the story?
So when I was in graduate school in 75 and 76, Roots was just coming out, and it was such a huge phenomenon of people, millions of people reading the book, and then the miniseries. And then in the early 80s, he actually reached out to us, and he was looking for his next project. He was working on many things, but one of the things that attracted him was Madam Walker's story. So we had dinner in New York, and at a place called Under the Stairs on Columbus Avenue. And during that conversation, he mentioned that he was going to hire a team of researchers to uncover details of Madam Walker's story. And I said, "Mr. Haley, I wrote my master's paper at Columbia on Madam Walker, and we have all of these letters at the Indiana Historical Society. I'd be happy to be the researcher for you." So that's how that relationship developed. And ultimately, he became a great mentor for me. And I did do the research. But as I say, he died in 1992. I had written a young adult book by then, which I actually finished writing on a freighter trip with Alex and two other people, his main researcher and another writer. So that was a really important mentoring relationship for me, and ultimately gave me a sense of how hard you research, how deeply you research, and how important storytelling is.
That's incredible. That's an incredible mentor to have as well. What was one of the biggest lessons you learned from him?
He told me, Alex had a big booming voice, and he'd say, "Baby," I mean, he was just a dear, dear man. But a key thing he said to me early on, he said, "Make a folder, a manila folder for every year of your story of the person's life, and put them in, buy some milk crates and create this filing system." So I, in fact, have a filing system that's really 2 rooms worth of material. But I started out, Madam Walker was born in 1867, died in 1919. So I started out 40 years ago or more with a folder for each year. And now it has turned into literally thousands of folders, not just about her life, but individuals. I have maybe 400 or 500 people who I have folders on. I have newspaper articles, photographs, business records, but it is the filing system that has allowed me to write 4 books and almost a 5th book.
Yeah. That's incredible. Getting a little bit overwhelmed just thinking about like the sheer mass of it, but there's so many years and like I'm sure information to uncover and like articles. What's some of the things that surprised you most during your research?
So when you think about this, when I was in high school, I went to public high school in Indianapolis, predominantly white schools, really excellent public school education. But history about women and people of color was non-existent, except we were slaves who were contented, which is what my um, high school textbook said. And so I wasn't really
Right.
interested in history because I didn't see myself. But it
Mhm.
left out all of these interesting people in my family, not just Madam Walker, but great great grandfathers who fought in the Revolutionary War and other people who were elected to office during Reconstruction. And, so a wide variety of really fascinating stories. And when I was in college in the early 70s, that's when a large number of women of color, especially, were starting to get their PhDs in history, and Black history was being taught. And so those stories were really being developed and we were learning them. So it's telling this story and realizing all of this rich material that's never been told or never been published. I mean, families had their stories, but feeling that I needed to be a steward of telling those stories was something that became very important to me.
And after your book was published in 2001, when did you first hear it was going to become a Netflix series? Was there already a script written? Did they have to get your permission?
So this is the usual Hollywood story where it takes a really long time. And as they say, it is a minor miracle when anything makes it to the screen. So the very first iteration of that was Alex coming to us saying he wanted to do a miniseries. And so I actually got a bit spoiled because the way Alex approached it is that I was very much a part of the process. We actually had 2 meetings on his farm in Kentucky in Tennessee, where he invited Mark Walper, and people who had been the producers of Roots, and Reuben Cannon, who was the casting director. And I invited 2 historians, and we just had these, a whole weekend of talking about the story. So I thought that's the way it worked. and then but then Alex died and he hadn't finished the project. So then after I wrote On Her Own Ground, in fact, while I was writing it, I actually had interest from Columbia TriStar and Sony. One of my college
Mm.
friends was an executive there. We hooked up a deal and they hired a writer. And so we thought that project was going to happen. But in the ways of Hollywood, that didn't happen. So that one fell through. Another decade goes by, there's another project that looks like it's going to happen with HBO. The head writer dies, so that didn't happen. And then there was this period of about a decade where the conventional wisdom in Hollywood was Black stories don't sell overseas, therefore we have no interest. And then April Rain did Oscar So White, and 12 Years a
Mm.
Slave and Selma and some of these other really successful movies happen. And then all of a sudden, there's huge interest. And so my story got swept up in that wave of interest. And I got calls from several people. I had conversations with about 4 studios. And I decided to go with Mark Holder, whose company Zero Gravity Management optioned my book. And then
Mhm.
this experience was really different from the one I'd had with Alex.
So in like researching for this, there's a video on YouTube posted by Netflix called "The Women Behind the Making of," right? And it's beautiful. And there's you, and there's like the co-showrunners and the director and the photography director. And it was amazing to watch because you guys all have like natural hair and like these gorgeous, colorful outfits. And it looks so cool. And it's just really empowering. And we get to see that a little bit more now, especially as media widens and opens up a bit, but it's also really important that continues to be in mainstream media. So, what needs to happen in media for a project like yours to continue being brought mainstream?
Yeah, that was a really magical day because everybody on the set, the photographer, the person who was the stylist, and all the showrunners, the directors, all Black women. I mean, it's just really incredible to pull together a project like that. But it's an interesting process for me because there was also some other stuff going on, and it was the head writer, while a Black woman, and I had a really different vision about what Madam Walker's story should be. I
Mhm.
saw this story as a story of empowering women. She wanted to focus on the competition between two women. For me, it kind of devolved into a cat fight. And so I was not very happy about that. But at the same time, having worked in television for so long, knowing what it means to have so many Black women in leadership roles, how hard everybody has worked to get to that point, having Octavia Spencer in the lead role, that there was a lot at stake. And so I wanted to be supportive of that. But then at the same time, I have to be authentic to my truth and to, tell the truth and hold people accountable. So it is absolutely amazing that a group of Black women with all of those credentials and all of that talent were working together on something like that. But I would have taken it to the next level and tweaked the story to make it more really about who Madam Walker was. But it's really important when I look at somebody like Ava DuVernay and I see how she is forcing Hollywood to change, not by going along with the trite cliches and the usual storylines, but by challenging it. That's kind of a role model for me.
You mentioned Ava DuVernay. Who's an incredible movie director? Who are some other like upcoming storytellers who from a diverse background that you have your eye on?
I wish that I were more familiar with the names in Hollywood, but I talked to someone yesterday who's working on some things on the side. Well, but there are the way things are so different now from when I was just coming out of journalism school. So when I was coming out of journalism school in the 70s, Hollywood really had not even begun to open up for um, women of color to be script writers. Susan is about a decade younger than I am. And
Mm.
Susan went to Hollywood and she did Cosby shows and now she was a showrunner. Recently they called her back. So she's somebody who's about a decade younger than I, who was able to hook up a Hollywood experience where my cohort of people, the way that we got into television or into journalism was the traditional journalism paths, but that Hollywood iteration was just starting to open up. And now there are so many people, there are so many programs at the studios, or there are people who just they pull out their phone and they're making movies. And so there's so much exciting stuff going on right now. And what I really love is that they don't have to go through the traditional studios. They can make their own thing, in the way that Ava DuVernay did a small budget. But there are a lot of young directors and young producers who are just saying, I want to tell the story the way that I want to tell the story. And I'm going to show it at Sundance, or I'm going to show it at a film festival. And those are the authentic stories that ultimately will bubble up.
Yeah, definitely. And telling those authentic stories are really important too because it takes courage to be able to like break the traditional like what has been told like again and again like you mentioned. So, what are some of the most valuable takeaways from the story and the life of Madam C.J. Walker that young leaders can use today?
Well, I think when the real story of Madam Walker, and that I hope I get another pass at, whether it's on a Broadway musical or doing another documentary that expands on what Stanley Nelson did with $2 in a Dream. Madam Walker's story is ultimately a story of women empowering women. And for someone who was a washerwoman, but who was mentored by the women of her church when she was in the missionary society and in the choir, but still a poor washerwoman, who ultimately was able to be transformed into an entrepreneur and a millionaire, but who didn't stop there, but turned around and used some of that same generosity that had been extended to her extended it to other women, and who was a real change agent, not afraid to speak up politically. For me, she is kind of a Black Lives Matter 1.0 because she was involved in the anti-lynching movement and she also supported the arts. So for me, that's the key part of her story. Women being mentored, mentoring others, helping people create generational wealth, leaving a legacy of political activity. So, but I think that for people who have seen Self-Made, it is important to know that there were so many Black women who were in leadership roles working on it. Octavia Spencer, for me, really brought Madam Walker to life, and for that, I will always be grateful. But it is important to understand that this Hollywood version of Madam Walker's story, while it shows the strength and the tenacity of Madam Walker, it veers far from the real story of Madam Walker. But we need more stories like this. Ida B. Wells's great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, is a good friend of mine. She's just written a new book on Ida B. Wells, the forward to the new edition of Ida B. Wells's memoir. And she is trying to figure out what direction she's going to go in movies, but she's seen my experience and she's very concerned about how that story is told. And I really have tried to use my experience to be an advocate for having historians and having people who truly know the authentic story in the writer's room or closely allied, not to block creativity, not to keep people from telling what actually happened, but to try to create some authenticity so that we truly have stories that go beyond the cliches. Part of the reason our stories have not been told in on the big screen to the extent that they should have been is that we refuse to fit into the mold that Hollywood wanted to put us in. You know, we started in Black people were depicted in Birth of a Nation in the way that through the white gaze, and that's who we have been for most of the time Hollywood has been making movies. But our stories are the real stories are so much more interesting than the boxes that people have tried to put us into. And I want us to be out of those boxes, tell our real story because they are some of the most amazing stories, not just in America, but in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really powerful. Um, that's all I have for you. But lastly, before we go, what is your next project that you're working on? You've written numerous books. What can we look out for you next?
So I am almost finished with the first major biography of Alelia Walker, my great grandmother, who was very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance and who's really different from the character who was in Self-Made. I'm eager to talk about her life and times and all of the famous people she knew, her travels, her visits to Ethiopia to meet the Empress and to the coronation of the Pope and London and Paris and South America, to really tell that story, to tell the story of what was really the first Black heiress in America. And I'm hoping that that will eventually be turned into a series. I think that would be great with me being involved in the storytelling. I'd love to do something on Broadway. I'd love to do a documentary on her. And I just want to keep telling stories and encouraging other people to tell their family stories because we have some amazing things to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much.